All right, well, thank you all for joining us today. I'm Anna Van Meter. I'm on the faculty here at NYU Child Study Center, and I'm the PI of the Investigating Mood Pathology Assessment Course and Treatment Lab. And in my lab, we study primarily technology and how we can use technology to extend evidence-based services to young people. And I'm joined today by Megan Moreno, and she's joining us from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And I'll let her introduce herself.
Sounds great. I'm really happy to be here and talk with you all. I am a professor of pediatrics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm an adolescent medicine physician as well as a researcher, and I also serve as the co-medical director for the American Academy of Pediatrics Center of Excellence on Social Media and Youth Mental Health. Really glad to be here.
All right. So if you're comfortable, we'd love to hear who you all are as well. So if you want to put your first name in the chat and maybe where you're joining us from and the age of any child or children that you have, we can get started on our presentation today, which we hope will be helpful in addressing some of your questions and concerns about managing social media and screen time within families.
This is so great. Thanks everyone for putting that info in the chat. It's really cool to see just where people are joining from, as well as all the different age ranges of kids. And one of our goals for this webinar is to build community across parents who are really interested in this topic, and also normalize that this is a really tricky topic that we're all wrestling with. And the good news is, I hope that one thing you'll get out of this webinar is there's a lot of right ways to do this, and feel like you've got a community of parents around you that are working on it as well. All right, I'm going to share my screen to share some slides, and we'll move into the didactic part of our time together today. As you can see, what we're hoping to do for today is starting out with those introductions. So great to see, again, all of the information in the chat and where everyone's coming from in terms of location, as well as how old your kids are. I'll be sharing a brief presentation, and then we're going to move into a case example that Dr. Van Meter is going to present that I hope will help us apply some of the concepts we'll have talked about. And again, kind of lean into the idea that there's a number of right ways to approach this, and that these situations with managing media across a household can be really complex. And then we'll end with some resources and question and answer. So I hope we'll have a jam-packed but enjoyable time together over lunch today. So I'm going to be focusing on some big picture ideas around social media use and how you can help your kids thrive in a digital age. And I'd like to start with just centering us in what we know. We know that the vast majority of teens use social media. And the reality now is that most adults also use social media. Over 75% of adults use social media either for fun or for work. We also know that the news media is really out there with a lot of doom and gloom on a lot of topics, but social media is definitely one of those topics that is kind of having a moment within the news media about how terrible and universally bad it is. So that's kind of what we've all been seeing, and that's led to a lot of concerns for parents about teen media use. And what I see from my patients, as well as in our research studies, is that teens are really tired of hearing that they're addicted to their phones and they should just put their phones down. I had a patient recently say, hey, you guys had the Just Say No campaign and that didn't work. So why do you keep telling us to just put our phones down? So teens are really ready to engage and have deeper conversations about this. And this positions us well to get ready for what those conversations can look like. So also, what do we know on the evidence side? Because that's where things can look really muddy and people can present present particular studies as showing one thing or another. And so that's why I really liked to look to these large national reports that bring together multiple research studies and help us understand overall, what do we know with certainty and what are we not really sure about? So one of those reports was sponsored by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. This is a large organization outside of the government. It is nonprofit, and they bring together experts whose job is over the course of a year to review all of the relevant research in that area. And that's what fueled this 2023 report. You can look it up online. You can look at the summary of it, and it's free and available. And what they found in looking at all of the literature out there around social media and health and well-being is that the research really cannot tell us cause and effect right now. Most of the research is looking at large populations of adolescents and really trying to make assumptions across those big populations. And most of that research is cross-sectional, which means if there is an association between, for example, a mental health concern like depression and social media use, we don't know whether the social media use is driving the depression or whether kids with depression symptoms are reaching out to use more social media use. So it really helps us understand this is complex and muddy, and probably we can't understand what's happening at that whole population level. There was also, during the same year, a US Surgeon General's advisory. That report also synthesized research from across the field, and they concluded that the relationship is complex and probably bidirectional. So that's kind of where we're coming from in terms of what we know in our social culture and what we know in the research sphere. So why is it so complicated? Well, there's a couple reasons why this relationship might be complicated. One is that we as scientists have been looking for a linear relationship. You do this thing more, and then more bad things happen. And the relationship might not be linear. It might be more of this inverse U-shaped curve. And there are multiple studies that have shown that there are some mental health impacts with either very low use, like shown on this graph, or very high use. So it may be that there is an impact, but it doesn't follow that linear relationship. What's interesting to me is that a lot of people were studying the relationship between internet use and depression back in the 90s, and they found these similar types of U-shaped curves. Another reason why it might be really complicated is because it might not just be about the number of hours. It might be more about the quality of use. And we can think about the quality of use as similar to what you might think about with television. Maybe when your kids were little, you were really focused on making sure they watch something like Sesame Street rather than watching something like cartoons, because you knew that it was going to give a higher quality experience. And there have been studies that have shown that there's different quality of experience with social media. In this study, they looked at how adolescents were interacting with social media, and they defined passive use as endless scrolling and active use as creating content, sharing content, interacting with others. And what they found was that people who had more passive use were more likely to have those negative mental health outcomes. But if you were using your social media time for active use and interacting with others, that was not associated with those negative outcomes. So that's another way that this relationship is complicated. So what do we know at this point? We know from the literature and from watching kids and from being around kids that there are definite benefits to social media. It can facilitate social connection. It can lead to learning. It can lead to creation of content and creative expression. It can help kids get involved in civic engagement. It can help kids through their normal developmental process of identity development, and it can reinforce aspects of themselves that are already strengths and that they want to continue to develop. There's also risks, and those risks are real, and they can include feeling a sense of competition or FOMO or comparison, looking at other people and thinking, why isn't my life like that? It can lead to problematic use, and for some kids that can look like compulsive use or addiction. It can lead to wasted time or displacement of other things that you should be working on. Youth can get exposed to content that is disturbing or inaccurate. Youth can also get exposed to negative peer interactions like bullying or harassment or hate speech. There can be risks for adults acting as predators for youth or pretending to be youth. And social media can reinforce aspects of a youth's personality or bring out parts of them that are not as positive and reinforce those. So social media can be viewed as, there's lots of metaphors, a double-edged sword, a hammer, just a tool that, depending on how it's used and what ends up happening, that determines the outcome. So one of the things that we've done within the AAP Center of Excellence is try to understand what a youth's experience is when they're interacting with social media. And one of the things that we've talked through is what determines that outcome from a social media experience of being positive or negative. And on the right here, you'll see this model that we've developed from the literature as well as from youth input, that each time a youth sits down and is interacting with social media, they're bringing their own individual characteristics to the table. They're bringing whether or not they're in a good mood or a lousy mood. Did they get enough sleep last night? Are they really dragging? Do they have underlying depression? What are their goals for when they're interacting with social media? And that's intersecting with that particular platform, its design, its content, and its algorithm. And that can lead to a positive or negative media experience. But that experience is against the backdrop of their family support, the other types of media they use. That's against the backdrop of what's their peer group? Is it a supportive peer group? What is their school like? What is their community support? And that is all set against the backdrop of social, economic, and climate stresses. So this model is meant to represent how this gets complicated and how important that offline world is in helping a teen navigate their online world. So from this framework, we have developed out a construct called the 5 C's of healthy media use. So what is this meant to do? It's meant to help frame up some of the key components of media use that parents can use when you talk to your kids about media use, that pediatricians like myself can use when we're talking with youth about media use in a clinic appointment. It can help us design better research studies that focus on things that go beyond screen time. And it's really meant to help shift the way that we're thinking and talking about media use. So what I'd like to do in the next couple minutes is walk us all through what we mean by each of these 5 C's and a couple questions that you might be able to use at home or in your interactions with youth to try to learn more about their media use. So the first C is child, and this really centers the conversation about media on a child and recognizing that teens are each unique individuals. They use media for many reasons. They use it in many ways. They use it for social reasons to connect to folks that they know. They use it for emotional reasons to calm down. They use it for functional reasons like connecting with peers on a school project. They use it to seek out and develop parts of their identity, and they use it to connect to other folks to advance their civic engagement. So each teen brings their own unique profile of who they are to their media use, and that determines what kind of media they look at, the kind of media they interact with, and what they get from it. And so there's a couple ways to think about asking your child to center on their media. And these are pretty broad, open-ended questions. I like to ask my patients, what's your media use like these days? I'm not particularly interested in whether they're on Reddit or whether they're on Discord. I want to know, what is their experience like? How are they feeling about it? And then I like this question about, do you ever worry about any aspects of your media use? And can we talk through some of those concerns? I want to help support you. So getting into the idea of what are kids worried about? My experience has been with patients that teens are pretty adept at being able to listen to their friends of what they're worried about, or worrying about things they've seen, or thinking about what they want to get out of their media and are they getting that? So opening up that door to talking about what they might be worried about. This resource to consider to help guide some of these conversations, because it can be kind of weird and hard to start these conversations if you haven't always had them, is that within the AAP Center of Excellence on Social Media and Youth Mental Health, we have a resource that focuses on how to start these conversations. So on the right, you see we have conversation starters by topic, like setting initial boundaries or struggles with meeting family expectations. And then we also have tips on some ideas for times that might make sense to have these types of conversations and times to probably avoid these types of conversations. So I hope these resources might be helpful in starting to put this into practice. The second C is content. It recognizes that it is developmentally appropriate for teens to be curious and to seek out different types of content. And that curiosity can lead to either intentional or unintentional exposure to content that is inappropriate, that's false, and that child might even find scary. And in the current social media environment, that content can include visual content like images and photos. It can include videos, which can feel very real to kids, and it can also include audio. And so just realizing that this content can have a big impact and that there's a lot of types of content they can access. And for some teens, their algorithms can get them kind of stuck in a content loop, and they can want to talk about ways to get out and get unstuck from that content loop. A couple questions to think about asking about content. Again, a really big, broad one that I really like to use in clinic is, tell me about some of the media content you've been enjoying lately. That helps me really center on what is that youth's experience? What are they seeing that's really inspiring and that they're learning from? And it also sets up a nice framework to be able to check in on worries. Like, have you seen any content you'd like to check in on? Like content that seemed inaccurate or made you feel worried or scared, and focusing on what have they seen and what do they want help with strategizing about. A content resource to consider, and many of you may have already used this with younger kids, is Common Sense Media. They have great sets of ratings and descriptions on what type of content is included within apps, within games, movies, and television. It's a great resource to look for identifying a family movie night or a game that everyone in the family can use. And I really do recommend doing co-viewing or co-playing when you can with your kids, especially when they're teens and it's harder to find ways to connect. This can be a great way to see what kind of content interests them and to have follow-up conversations about what you saw. The third C is calm. It focuses on ways that media may or may not be used to try to help teens get calm. And we know that it's very common for teens as well as adults, let's be honest, to use social media as a distraction or as a way to regulate emotions when your emotions are running hot or when you're really, really stressed. So what I often talk about in clinic is working with teens to help them build their calm toolbox. And that toolbox needs to be available to them to help them calm down or to regulate their emotions. And that calm toolbox might include media or other electronics, games. It might include social media, but it also needs to include some offline tools, things that they can reach for, things like music or reading or art, taking a walk, baking, going outside, or finding someone to connect to. So a couple questions to ask about calm. The first one is framed based on the toolbox idea, kind of explaining to a youth, I know media can be a useful tool when you're feeling stressed, and it's normal to use media as a distraction at times. But I'd like to make sure you have a few options, like a calm toolbox. What are other options that you have to calm yourself down that don't involve media? And then following up with, what ideas would you like to try to add to your calm toolbox? The next C is crowding out. And one thing that I think about a lot when I see patients is that there's really essential health behaviors or aspects of health for teens that are so important at this age. And that includes physical activity and the really tricky one, sleep. Sleep is so essential to adolescence. And sleep is one area where there's really strong research showing that media use can interfere with sleep quantity as well as sleep quality. So this is a really key one that I like to lock into with patients to make sure that their media use is not crowding out these really essential behaviors. So some of the ways that I like to ask these questions include, let's talk about how to be sure your devices or your social media use isn't having a negative impact on your sleep. So in the AAP and within the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, they recommend having your device outside your room when you sleep. We know that that doesn't work for every kid. There are circumstances that can make it so that that's not going to work. So what are some other options? How do we meet that kid where they are? Well, let's talk about phone settings. Let's think about where is that device placed in the bedroom. And let's also think about what are your sleep routines? What are your behaviors? What are the ways you get ready for sleep? And then for physical activity, I'd like to ask, how are you feeling about where your physical activity is these days? And do you feel like your media use is helping or harming your goals? Because sometimes for kids, it can really be a motivator to do physical activity, and sometimes it gets in the way. One way that I think to manage that crowding out concept is to think about a family media plan and having a family media plan that really focuses on certain goals. Maybe it's a family media plan that focuses on making sure everyone in the family is getting good sleep. Or maybe it's a family media plan that focuses on making sure that physical activity doesn't get crowded out. So the family media plan gives you a list of priorities to choose from. It gives a very vast list. So I do think, kind of honing in on what you really want to get out of it when you sit down to make it is super helpful. And then it gives example practical tips that you can choose from, but you can also make your own. And then you can print or you can share that finished plan. And it's really meant to be a plan that is shared across family members, that parents are meant to be involved in also placing limits or guidelines around their media use to help do that role modeling that's so important for adolescents. And our final C is communication. And this is put last as really one of the most important parts of this approach. And it's really tricky. We know that parent-child communication is critical across many domains of adolescent health. Parents are already managing a lot when you're raising kids. And so what I recommend is thinking about having these conversations early and often rather than feeling like you've got to design and deliver this perfect monologue that often ends up sounding like a lecture. I know from experience of trying this, and having this be a normal topic that you and your kids can check in on. So what makes this tricky? Well, parents are using devices and social media too. And we know that particularly since the pandemic, parents are bringing more work home and have more stressors. So it can be really tricky to try to moderate your own device use at home. But it can be really impactful to be able to also put your device down when you can and interact with your child, even if they're not super enthusiastic about interacting with you. One of our previous studies looked at teens, a large sample of teens and all different types of media behaviors, and which teens had positive outcomes in terms of well-being and which teens struggled. And one of the most critical variables in that equation was the parent-child relationship and whether the teen perceived that the parent was using social media too much. So parents who had that positive parent-child relationship, parents whose kids did not perceive them as always being on their phone, those were huge positive predictors for youth having positive outcomes, even across variations in how much they use social media. So it makes a huge difference. In Some of the communication recommendations that I think about, again, checking in early and often, looking for those natural time points where it already is coming up. And as parents, I think it's really okay to acknowledge that this is something that you're working on also. One of the tricks and tips that I've learned from patients I've seen is to use something that I refer to as signpost language. So when you're interacting with your device and it's in a setting where maybe your child is more expecting you to be present with them, giving them some reasons and some understanding of why what you're doing is important. So here's an example. Maybe you have a device-free dinner and your phone rings and you need to pick it up. Being able to quickly say, "Ooh, it looks like your grandma's calling. I'm a little worried about what's going on with their health. I'm going to answer this." So you're allowing them to understand when the rules need to be broken and why. Another example is if you have a child who's learning to drive, starting to use signpost language in the car. "Hey, I'm going to be driving now. So if you'll notice, I'm setting my phone over here so it's out of reach, because if a text goes off, I'm going to be tempted to answer it." And then even acknowledging to your child, "Wow, I got carried away scrolling through that. I think I'm going to set an alarm next time." Or, "What do you do when you're trying to set a limit on how much time you spend scrolling?" It's really okay to acknowledge that this is something you're working on too, and to be able to talk through it with your child and role model how you're making those decisions so that they can learn from those. A couple communication resources to consider within the Center of Excellence. We have a question and answer portal, and that question and answer portal is open to many different folks. We've gotten questions from clinicians, from educators, from parents and caregivers, and we even get questions from teens. So we've heard from some folks that the parent and the child will sit down and come up with a question together and submit it. And then what we do with those questions is we do a review of the current evidence and provide an evidence-based answer and some other resources and ideas to explore it further. So you can look through the portal at past questions that might have an answer to a question you're thinking about, and you can feel free to submit your own questions. We would welcome to get them from you. So here's a couple examples of some questions that parents have submitted and where you could take a look and, maybe this is a topic that's interesting to you. How does a parent begin to set limitations on tech time when there's none? How do you deal with a spike in aggressive tantrum behaviors due to new limitations? These are very real questions, and we take them really seriously and want to provide resources. And then the other example, maybe you do some work in your kid's school or in the community, being able to ask if we can help provide resources for you to support you in that work. So that is an option to think about as other options to bring into your communication practices. So I've given you a whirlwind tour of the 5 C's of healthy media use. That includes child, centering on your child as an individual; content, understanding that content plays a big role in what those mental health and mental well-being outcomes might be; thinking about supporting your child and building out their Calm toolbox; keeping an eye and making sure that media isn't crowding out really essential health behaviors; and then leaning into that communication in the way that's going to work for you and your family and for you and that child. Again, to learn more, we'd love to hear from you or have you explore our resources. And I know that we'll bring some of these up as we get closer to the end to remind of some resources. So I'm really appreciative of the opportunity to share some of this. This slide describes the grant that supports the Center of Excellence. At this point, I'll stop sharing and we will move to thinking about applying some of this into a case.
Great, thanks, Megan. All right, so I'll just briefly read the case, and we're really hoping that this will be an opportunity for all of you to give input, to think about some of the suggestions that Megan just reviewed and how those might apply to this case and how it might relate to the own experiences that you've had in your family. So Jaden is a 15-year-old high school sophomore. He's funny, smart, and creative, especially when making videos for TikTok. Over time, his parents notice he's spending more and more time on his phone, often staying up late and struggling to get up for school. Even during activities they do as a family, like watching movies on Friday nights, he's on his phone. His grades have dropped slightly, and he seems irritable when he's not online. His parents become concerned after catching him scrolling under the covers at 2 a.m. They decide to set a clear limit: no phone after 9:30 p.m., and the phone must be left charging in the kitchen overnight. At first, Jaden resists. He says that he needs his phone to communicate with classmates about schoolwork and that his friends rely on him for support. His parents compromise on a later curfew for phone use, 11 p.m. So just pausing here, I'm curious to hear from everybody what you think about the approach that Jaden's parents have taken. Are there things that you think maybe they could have done differently, or things that you particularly like about how they approached this? And also, how do you think things will progress from here? Do you expect that the way that they've worked through things with Jaden will be successful and that he'll be getting more sleep and engaging more with the family, or would you expect a different outcome? So if you want to put your thoughts in the chat, that would be great. So one person is pointing out the fact that the parents did listen to Jaden's input and they were flexible about the curfew. So they were open to compromising. Seems like maybe they could have had a little bit more of an involved conversation to learn more about what exactly he's doing on his phone at different times and what he likes about his social media. Maybe it would have been good for the parents to have clearer rules about phone use and time limits. But they at least noticed at some point that not having limits was causing problems. They could emphasize on, consistent with the crowd out, maybe what was happening negatively with his sleep because of his social media. And maybe having a family meeting so that everybody in the family could talk about the pros and cons of using social media and phone use, and maybe building a family media plan together. So it seems like many of our attendees think that it was good that the parents took a flexible approach, and maybe it would have been good if they had set limits earlier and had more of an involved conversation with Jaden. I'm curious to see if people have thoughts about maybe what might happen from here if this curfew seems like it would be successful, maybe based on your own experiences trying to set some limits like this, what might happen next? So it seems like people think that being consistent with the rule will be very important. I think one thing that can be hard sometimes is if you go from no limits to a limit, there might naturally be sort of a period of adjustment for everybody. And it might take a little bit of time to figure out, what is the right time for that curfew, or is that the main limit that they want to stick with, or would other types of limits work better for their family? So in this case, the first week went okay, but then things started to slide. Jaden brought his phone to his room again, claiming that he needed it for homework, and his parents weren't always awake to make sure that he puts the phone in the kitchen at night. His parents start commenting more often when he's on his phone at dinner or during other family activities, which irritates him. His dad finds him online late one night and they get into a heated argument. Jaden accuses his parents of not understanding what it's like to be a teenager today and not caring about his social well-being. He says social media is how he stays connected and feels like part of his friend group. His mom wants to ease up and rebuild trust. His dad is frustrated and thinks stricter rules are the only answer. Conflict increases between the parents, and Jaden starts spending more time in his room to avoid being criticized. The house feels tense, and conversations about screen time turn into arguments. Everyone feels stuck. Um, so just a few questions to consider about this. One thing to think about is how do generational differences between Jaden and his parents and potential parenting differences between his mom and dad contribute to their family conflict about social media? Also wonder, what do we think this family might be able to do to get back to a point where they can have a productive conversation about social media? And what are some of the steps the parents could take to help Jaden feel more understood? And as part of that, how might the family prioritize their shared goals for social media use? So it sounds like validating Jaden's feelings and how it might be hard for him to have these new limits might be important. One thing that I often emphasize with the families that I work with is that, the adolescents usually are kind of the experts. And so really hearing from them about, what they like, what's important to them about social media can be important because there may be functions that that's serving that we as parents aren't even fully aware of. I think they also, like having an opportunity to teach us about something and to really, talk about something that they might be passionate about. I think one thing that's coming up in the chat that Megan also mentioned earlier is parents' own phone use and how that can sort of complicate these situations when the adolescent might feel like their parent is being sort of hypocritical, if that the parent is able to use their phone whenever they want to, and the adolescent feels like the rules sort of only apply to them and that that's not fair. I think that the family media plan can be a really great resource in situations like this where the family can sort of have their own shared rules for everybody. Um, and also think about, for specific individuals within the family who might be more vulnerable, say, to sleeping problems, maybe they need a different set of guidelines than other people in the family. I like the excuse me, I like the idea of talking with Jaden about the content that he's creating for social media. Um, and I think, earlier in the presentation, we heard about how there's a lot of kind of doom and gloom in the press about social media. But there can be a lot of really positive, creative things about it. And so maybe Jaden's parents would be reassured if they could see that a lot of his time was going into making things that were really cool, versus just sort of passively scrolling on social media. I'm curious if any of our attendees have found that they um, don't have the same viewpoint as a co-parent or maybe other adults who are really involved in raising their children, like grandparents or other people, and maybe how some of those adult to adult conversations go about this topic. Earlier in the chat, a few people raised the importance of consistency. And I think that that's a really important element here. And so if you are co-parenting, um, talking with the other co-parent or, caregivers about what can you all agree on and what's realistic to consistently reinforce. Because if the rules are different depending on who's home or where the child is, I think that that can create more conflict and confusion and sort of, you know, backsliding when rules aren't consistently enforced. And so there might be an ideal that you have in mind, but that might not be something that is feasible right now to enforce. And so thinking about, what would be agreeable to everybody that we feel like is realistic for our family. I think, some people are raising some problems that they've had with grandparents or other caregivers using screens in ways that they don't agree with. And I think that that can be really hard. If you're relying on other people to help with childcare, it can be difficult to manage sort of imposing rules on their household or their time. Um, with your children. Um, One thing that I think can be helpful is maybe sharing with them some of the data that we have about how social media or screen use can negatively impact sleep and physical activity or relationship time, just so that other caregivers understand why it's important to you to limit screen time and that it's not just kind of an arbitrary rule that you would like. I think if they understand the rationale behind it, sometimes that can be helpful, or work with them to figure out how they can put a limit on the app that they might be using so that if you agree that some amount of time is appropriate, that they have an easier time sticking with that. All right. Thanks everybody for your comments about the case. Just a few more things to go through. Whoops. One thing that might be useful in starting some of these conversations with your own child or children is that you could even use this case as an example, and maybe mention that you participated in this webinar and that it's something that you're really thinking a lot about. I think oftentimes it's helpful to use an example outside of your family to start some of these conversations, because it's less likely to make people feel defensive or like they, are sort of under attack in any way. So, maybe you can ask your child about their peers or how other families handle some of these issues, just as a way of kind of exploring this topic in a, less judgmental feeling way. Another thing that I think is important that Megan mentioned earlier is to try to have these conversations when there isn't an active conflict about this topic or any other topic. If you can do it when both you and your child are relaxed, maybe even, like doing something else so it doesn't feel as serious, like when you're in the car or cooking dinner or something like that. Right. So I just wanted to review again some of the resources that we mentioned, and then we can open it up for questions. And there is a handout that will include all of the resources that we went over today that everybody will be receiving. So hopefully that will be helpful. So I definitely want to encourage everyone to visit the Center of Excellence on Social Media and Youth Mental Health website. We're going to talk about a few of the resources there, but there's a lot more. It's really a fantastic resource for families. Um, so Megan mentioned the Q&A. I think this is really valuable and amazing that they put the time into answering people's questions. So both reviewing questions that others have asked and potentially asking your own can be great. They also have conversation starters that can help, facilitating some of these conversations that can be difficult. And our conversation today is focused on adolescents, but they do have resources aimed at families with younger children as well. One of the things that I think can be really helpful too is this glossary of digital media platforms. Like, I think it can feel a little bit intimidating for us as parents if we don't know the lingo and we're not exactly sure what the different platforms are or terminology. So this can help you at least get started. And I think, I mentioned earlier that sometimes young people like to feel like the expert. And so it can be good to just go in with a curious mind and ask lots of questions. And I think, figuring out the lingo and like how they're using different emojis and things like that too can be a way to have a good conversation. Another great resource is this family media plan. So you can enter the information about your family and it really guides you well through the different steps. And this is a great activity to do as a family together. Another resource I wanted to mention that hasn't come up earlier is the Center for Digital Thriving. And in particular, they have an exercise about thinking through your values and how those relate to technology. And I think that this can be a good activity to do with your adolescent in terms of thinking about what's important to them. What do they value about themselves, about other people, and how can technology help them to achieve their goals related to their values, and also recognize ways in which technology might be undermining their values and their ability to achieve their goals. So I think that this can be kind of a fun and interesting activity to do. And then Common Sense Media, which has a ton of content across all different types of media, but they do have some great resources for screen time and social media as well. Megan already mentioned this. And so I'll close the slideshow here and we can hear any questions that you all might have. So one question that I think came up as things that were pre-submitted before today is sometimes adolescents really don't acknowledge that their screen time or that their social media is a problem at all. And so then it might be hard to enter this conversation at all if they're, not sort of open to that idea. Um, One thing that I think can be helpful about that is, asking if there are other peers that they do see as, having trouble with their social media exposure, and, eliciting from them, what about your peers' social media use do you think might be problematic? So helping them kind of identify what the threshold of problematic or not might be, and then, how they see themselves on one side of that versus the other. And that can also give you an opportunity, like Megan mentioned earlier in the 5 Cs of just sort of um, commenting on things that you think might be problematic or any concerns that you have or that they have. But it's a process. I don't necessarily think it's going to be one conversation where you help them see things exactly the way that you do. Um, reading the um, so we have a question about parents having access to their child's social media account. This is one that I think may vary by child, and it might be sort of an individual decision within the family. I do think that trust building is really important. And if the child doesn't know that you're looking at their account and you are, and they find that out, that can be extremely damaging to the relationship and your ability to be sort of a moral authority in this situation and enforce the family rules moving forward. Um, so I think having that conversation with your child and figuring out, if there are specific things that you're concerned about that you think you would need to look at their account for, and then maybe doing that with them. So like sitting down together and having them show you what's in their account versus doing it in a secretive way. I don't know, Megan, if you have other thoughts about that.
I completely agree with you. I think it is really different by that individual kid, and I've seen a lot of ways that parents have navigated this. I think for some families, the login is the expectation, and being clear about what you're going to do with that login, I think is really important for trust, as you mentioned. I've seen other families where they require the accounts to be linked as friends so that you can see what your child's posting and they can see what you're posting, and you can talk about content that you're seeing. I've seen some families where they set certain dates where they kind of sit down and look through the child's feed to see what they're exposed to together. I think there's a lot of different ways to do this, and it kind of gets at what is your core worry and how do you use that guideline to be a teachable moment to your child and to stay connected to them. Because the idea is as they get older that you're not maybe going to have that login when they're off at college. So how can you use that experience to prepare them to be a successful, autonomous adult who's going to probably keep navigating social media?
We have another question about the best age for having access to social media. I think this also varies by child, and sort of rather than the, exact year that they are, sort of developmentally where they are and how well you think they can handle, being exposed to this whole new world, and the, you know, benefits and risks that come with that. I think in some of the um, conferences that I've participated in or articles that I've read, many experts think that, high school can be a good age, and that middle school and younger, it's a little bit harder for children that age to manage all of the information that they're getting. But I think it does depend on the maturity of your child. And it can be hard when other families are making different choices about that. So um yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And it often ends up depending on what that child's peer group is doing. And, if all their peers are in a certain spot, they're going to be more likely to want to be there. And that's pretty developmentally normal. One of the other things that I think about with this question is that a number of years ago, we did a research study and we went to early adolescents and pre-adolescents, and we asked them the question, what is the right age to get a kid a phone? And I thought, gosh, maybe we can solve this problem by, factoring in what you think. And what I was so incredibly impressed by is what they said was, it's not an age, it's being able to meet certain developmental milestones. It's being able to be civil in an anonymous setting when you're under stress. It's being able to keep track of your phone and not lose it. It's being able to know when to put it down and when to get your homework done. And it was just such a great discussion that really has shifted my thinking to milestones rather than age. But one of the other things they said in that study was, please don't give us a phone or talk to us about it until we ask for it. Don't give us your hand-me-down and assume that we want to start using a phone. Don't let grandma give me a phone when I'm 10 if I haven't asked for it. Because if I haven't asked for it, I don't need it yet. And once you have a phone, you're probably never going to not have a phone. So that to me makes me think about the question about the 13-year-old who doesn't have social media and hasn't asked for it. It might be interesting just to wait and let that situation settle, because the other thing that can happen with adolescents is if you go to them and say, you can't have this, now they're going to want it. So, one strategy might be to kind of wait and see how this plays out. Maybe none of his friends have it. Maybe he's not even thinking about it. So I think it gets at kind of knowing your child and knowing what they're asking for and trying to push them on, do you meet these milestones to be ready to do this?
Great points. Um, and then we have a comment, I guess, about how, once phone use becomes problematic or there are kind of some underlying concerns that phone use exacerbates or becomes, more problematic within the family, kind of how to handle that. And I think, you know, going back to some of the things that we heard about earlier in the presentation of just, maybe concerns that you have or things that you've noticed and talking with the child about whether or not they're making those same connections about how their social media or phone use might be related to some of the difficulties that they're experiencing or even, conflict in the family. Like I would really like us to have a better relationship and to enjoy our time together more. Like this is how I see, our phone use interfering with that. So how could we do things differently so that we don't have to keep having this same argument or feel like we're walking on eggshells around each other.
Yeah, I completely agree with that approach.
Great. So it looks like this is all the time that we have today for questions. So on behalf of the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the NYU Child Study Center, thank you all so much for participating. It's hard, when we're just doing it with chat, but I really appreciate your input and participation. And please, keep an eye out for other upcoming webinars.